For those of you who have not had the privilege to hear him speak yet, I'm honored to introduce him to you today. Saladin Allah is an early childhood educator, author, and the third great-grandson of famed Underground Railroad freedom seeker Josiah Henson, whom Harriet Beecher Stowe used as the primary narrative for her famous 19th century novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Saladin is the founder of the Atlanta School for Gifted Youngsters and the author of 23 books. 5 are part of a curatorial activism archive in the British Library. He is a featured historian in the 2019 IMAX film Into America's Wild, narrated by Morgan Freeman, and a featured historian in the 2020 award-winning docuseries Enslaved, executive produced by and starring Samuel L. Jackson. Saladin is a featured educator in a 2022 United Nations outreach program on the transatlantic slave trade and slavery video, a featured historian in Secrets on the Border, the Nature of Things CBC documentary directed by Adrian Callender, and a producer and featured historian of the Buffalo and Erie County Naval Park exhibit and documentary Two Wars, The Road to Integration. Saladin is the director of the Atlanta School for Gifted Youngsters, director of community engagement at the Niagara Falls Underground Railroad Heritage Center, public art coordinator for the Niagara Falls National Heritage Area, a machine inspector for the Niagara County Board of Election, and a human rights commissioner in the city of Niagara Falls, New York. Today he will be presenting The Power of Cultural Competency, about boldly traversing cultural borders and exploring the value of diversity in a changing global landscape. Welcome back, Saladin.
Thank you. Thank you. Got you. I got you. Yeah. First, I want to say thank you, the UUEA family, for welcoming me back. All the guests who are here as well, and then also our guests who are here on Zoom joining us as well. I got to give a special shout out to my stylist, Anusha. She's my 4-year-old daughter, and she picked this out for me this morning, and I'm glad that she picked this instead of my 'cause I had my Chippendale costume and my Black Panther costume laid out, and she chose this instead. So that's pretty cool. When I was sharing this event on social media, I went to your Facebook page, and I had a chance to look at it. And I looked, and I saw like some mad faces on like the promotional materials, and I tell you, my first thought was, I bet you it's some rednecks attached to those red angry faces on those emojis, right? But then my second thought was like, what are you mad about? You know, like you think about it, and it's like you have people, our citizens, who would actually come to a angry conclusion about, I'm not sure, was it because I'm a Black man? Is it because of my name? Is it because of your institution hosting me? You know, it could be a variety of different things, but people actually took the initiative to come to that conclusion about this. They don't know me. They have no clue what I'm getting ready to talk about, but yet that was their conclusion. And I think it's important to point out that this is really the level of ignorance that we have to confront. We have to confront this level of ignorance. Now, some people, they may just look at it as kind of innocuous, like, oh, it's just, people trolling and, but usually when you see ignorance, they have their 2 twin siblings that's hanging out with them. And that's indifference and apathy. And that's the danger with that type of attitude. Because when a person has that type of perspective towards you, they don't even know you. Then they probably have that type of perspective towards your family members, your other community members. And when you include their siblings in that equation, indifference and apathy, this is the type of posture that would allow anything to happen to someone, because they're that disconnected from you and taking that type of stance, So I wanted to make sure that I addressed that, just initially, and just to point out that, this is what we're actually dealing with, So as I was mentioned, I'm going to be speaking about cultural competence, and this is going to be an interactive discussion. I'm not just going to get up here and lecture, but I'm going to ask you some perspectives on some of the things that, you think, and willfully some of the people that were angry when they saw this event are actually online and they're watching and they could actually learn something at the same time. So, ready? Okay. Yes. Okay. You can go to the next slide. Okay. So as was mentioned, I'm the director of community engagement over at the Niagara Falls Underground Railroad Heritage Center. By show of hands, how many people have not been there? Good. So now you got some place to go. Cool. So our mission is to essentially reveal authentic stories of Underground Railroad freedom seekers and abolitionists in Niagara Falls that inspire visitors to recognize modern injustices that stem from slavery and take action towards an equitable society. So that's just a fancy way of saying what we share in our space is to get people to understand that these weren't just isolated, siloed events that happened in the past, but they give you insight into what we're presently dealing with and empower us and educate us on how we can chart a better future. Next. So we start off with just asking the question, what's cultural competence? It's the ability to understand, appreciate, and interact with people, cultures, or belief systems different from one's own, essentially seeing and valuing diversity. Now, going back to what I was saying earlier about the trolls that were on social media, the ironic thing about it is because, they're probably community members, possibly Western New Yorkers, so they probably like the Bills. So they watch Josh Allen every week throw footballs to black athletes, right? And unless you are living a diet like pilgrims, I'm sure the type of cultural diversity and food that we have access to here in Western New York, I'm sure that they might go to Taco Tuesdays, right? Or they might experience some of the other different type of cuisines that we offer here in this community. So a person with that attitude is literally immersed in cultural diversity. The competent aspect of it, I don't know, that's still up for debate. But a lot of times people may have certain attitudes about things and be disconnected from things that they're literally immersed in simultaneously. Next. So what is diversity? I'm gonna grab. So what is diversity? Differences in racial and ethnic, socioeconomic, geographic, academic, blah 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 variety. Right? Okay. So you go on to the next slide. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the history of credit card machines. Was anybody around when those credit card machines? No, you ain't got to show your hand. Just wink at me. 1959. That's what the original credit card machines look like. That's the cardholder's name, and you would basically slide it across. And this is for the younger people here. Slide it across to put an impression on some carbon paper, and they would keep the slips as a record. Right. Next slide. 1970, it changed a little bit because now the cards added a magnetic strip. And also in 1979, the first electronic machine was launched by Visa. And this also was the year that MasterCharge became MasterCard and credit cards were replaced to include that magnetic strip. 1980s to the present, you started to see the development of stationary landline credit card machines and portable wireless credit card machines. And that's a tremendous growth in terms of technology in that short period of time, right? Next. So now, I want you to tell me, what do you notice that's similar about all of these different inventions? What's something that you notice that's similar? What'd you say? Okay, they have numbers. Anybody else? Buttons. Yep. Anybody else? Definitely. Money. They're all connected to money in some form or fashion. Yes, they all use cards. You can go to the next slide. Okay. Press it again. They're all right-handed dominant. All of them, right? You could go back. All of those inventions were created with right-handed dominant people in mind. By show of hands, how many people are left-handed in this room? These were not made for y'all, right? It was a right-handed dominant person. So even when you look at all of these other different type of inventions, right-handed dominant. I mean, just a few short years ago, Oreos came out with a pack of cookies with a green lift tab label that was made specific for left-handed people. Seriously, right? You look at these joysticks for video games, rulers, all of these objects are just some of the different examples of things that are created with right-handed dominant people in mind. Now, that's something that most people really don't pay attention to unless you're left-handed. You know this every single day and you're constantly aware of it. And you have to deal with us right-handed dominant people who really don't care too much about what you think, right? Next slide. Now, I point that out because a lot of times when you think about a right-handed dominant status quo, a lot of times people who are not right-handed are not even included into that equation at all, or consideration is never even really given for that segment of our families, right? Our community members, our citizenry. If you look at this picture right here, what do you think is missing? Because I'm sure that the people that created this image and this ad, they had the best of intentions to express diversity. Who's missing? Exactly. You don't see a person that would be considered disabled in this picture. The first thing I notice, I don't see me, right? But again, somebody may have had the best of intentions to say, oh, we're going to make this as diverse as possible, but it still misses the mark, right? With the best of intentions. Next slide, please. Now check this one out. What do you notice here? You probably came in here this morning not even expecting to answer no questions, huh? You just go sit here like this. What's missing? You said one handicap spot? Okay, what else? Anything else that you've noticed? Now, my community in Niagara Falls, we had a similar, it wasn't a dual business like this, but it was a dollar store, just like on our main street. And this is how I became aware of what I'm going to show you with this. Usually I'm driving down Main Street all of the time and I would see a person in a wheelchair sitting out in front of the dollar store. And I was just thinking, assuming, and we all know what the root word of assume is. I'm just thinking that they're just panhandling all of the time. And I'm like, wow, they're really panhandling, because there would be times I would drive by, it's raining, it's snowing, and there's somebody sitting out there in a wheelchair, right? One day I happened to pull up to go into the store and there's a person sitting outside in a wheelchair. I walk up to the store and I'm practicing not looking at them, because I know if I look at them, they're going, okay, you see me, right? And they're going to ask for some money, right? So I'm walking by, and as I walk by, I say, excuse me, could you hold the door open for me? I've been waiting for somebody to pull up so that they could open the door for me. What? All of this time. That was the reason that people in wheelchairs were sitting out in front of the store, because it was not handicap accessible. So when you look at those doors, those are not automatic doors, right? And that's exactly how it was in my community. Person that set that business up there, they didn't have nobody that was in a wheelchair sitting at that table, or to give them some insight and input to say, you know, this is something that you should make sure that you include, right? When you look at this, it's the exact same way. It doesn't even have shelter from any of the elements. So if a person's sitting in a wheelchair there and they come and pull up, you know, whatever, if it's raining or snowing, they're going to have to sit there until somebody pulls up and opens the door for them, right? Now, I would have never I would have never recognized something like this unless I had that experience. So now, because I have that knowledge, I can make wiser decisions when it comes to advocacy for our family members, our community members, our citizenry that have those type of concerns that are important to include in the decisions that we make, right? Next slide. And now we have also blatant, blatant examples of advertisements and things that are put out in the public where you know that they had no consideration for certain segments of our family, our community, and our citizenry, right? You see this one way at the top. It says coolest monkey in the jungle. I don't know who made that. I don't know who would make an ad like that, right? And then you look at this other dove one and you can see what that's telling you. And then the one below it, the perfect body. And these are just some examples of just a lack of consideration, on various different levels. Some things are blatantly racist like this. And then there's sometimes people who are just thinking from a right-handed dominant perspective. They just did not consider others. And I would say that, you have your segment of the population here that are advocates of white supremacy and racism. And they believe that in their heart. But I would say the majority of people are usually just ignorant because for the most part, they're not exposed to the sense of cultural competence that's necessary in order to elevate the mindset of people to really be connected with a sense of global citizenry. And I say global citizenry because how many people travel to other countries? When you go to other countries and people find out you're from America, a lot of times their attitude is like, oh my goodness, I feel so bad for you. That's a lot of the times the attitude. And here in America, people typically speak one language. You go to other countries, minimally, people speak two languages. That's minimally, right? Next slide, please. You could go back. Yeah, so in terms of the landscape where we live at, that plays a role in what we're exposed to. You look over here in the top left corner, Vermillion, South Dakota. I had an opportunity to travel there. I was speaking at University of South Dakota, their legal department. And as you see, it's 87% white. So when I got off that plane, it was just me and the black person taking the bags off the plane. There was only two black people in Vermillion, South Dakota, right? And then when I get to the township of Vermillion, I could tell that the only real interaction that they may have had with black people was probably what they seen on Fox News, right? But then in terms of like entrepreneurship, I was thinking in the back of my mind, like, yo, I could probably start a business here and just people pay me to take pictures with a real black person. You know what I'm saying? But yeah, that's the kind of environment that it was, right? So now you think about children who grew up in an environment like that. Usually they're not going to see me every day, right? And if they're watching Fox News all of the time or some of these, extremely violent or sexist videos, they're going to think that I'm a certain way as well, right? But as parents living in a community, parents and guardians have to take another step and be more intentional about exposing children to cultural diversity because it's not really around you at all. You can do that intellectually by exposing children to literature and programming that's appropriate, that gives you an accurate account and perspective of other people from other places. And you can take your children places to see different things. But usually that's not the reality for a lot of families where we live at, right? A lot of families are very siloed and very disconnected from the world, right? And unfortunately, children that grow up in environments like that without that type of cultural exposure or diversity have a very slanted view of the human family. And then you can see the same thing in Lithonia, Georgia. That's a possibility. Because if you go there, it's mostly black folks in Lithonia, Georgia, right? And if you just grow up in that environment, where everybody that you see in your community looks the same, everybody in your schools look the same, the business owners and everybody looks the same, you might have some slanted views about people from Vermilion, South Dakota. So parents in that environment also have to be intentional about taking their children places and exposing them to cultural enrichment so that they have more of a well-rounded perspective of our human family. When you look at New York, that's much more diverse, right? How many people's been in New York City? I remember one time I was walking around in New York City and I felt myself frowning for no reason. I'm just walking down the street and I felt and I'm like, why am I mad? You know, but it was just the environment itself, right? But if you grow up in New York City, you're likely to come in contact with different people from different places, right? Next slide, please. But if you look at Toronto, Toronto's similar to a New York City. It definitely smells better. But you grow up in environments in Toronto where the children, you know the difference between a person that's Filipino and a person that is from Burma, from a person that's from Japan, from South Korea. You know those distinctions because you're living in an environment where you're exposed to that. But if you don't have that type of environment, you might just think everybody's Asian and just mistake people for who they are and their cultural heritage. So you see the same kind of dynamic even on the Canadian side, where if you went to Burnaby, British Columbia, you see it's 37% people who are classified as white. You have more of a Asian community of Chinese, South Asian, Filipino, Korean. So a person born in that environment, they're going to be exposed to different things in terms of cultural perspective that under other circumstances they wouldn't have access to. So that's just right around them in an environment, right? Every time I come through here, like for these speaking engagements, I'm going to be honest, I'm not really comfortable because this does not look like my community. And this is usually not a community that I would drive through after 8 p.m. Because most likely and this is me assuming again, right? I could possibly get pulled over or something like that because these are similar communities that are outside communities from where I live at in the city of Niagara Falls, right? Chatham, in Kent, that's 92% white. And that is a community that's similar to Vermilion, South Dakota, right? I show you all of these landscapes because, again, they play a primary role in constructing the brain architecture of our children, right? And if we don't have access to certain things in our environment, we really have to be intentional about investing in those resources to make sure that our children are exposed to different things. As was mentioned earlier, I have an early childhood learning center known as the Atlantis School for Gifted Youngsters. And my background is early childhood education, so I taught pre-K for some time. And I remember one day I came into class and I was all excited. I had this lesson plan because I was doing this program called Healthy Me. And what the program is I expose my students to healthier food options, things that they may have never really tried before. And I was so excited. I came in one day and I had some ingredients for like guacamole, right? And I'm not sure if you could all relate to this, but a lot of times if something's mushy and green, a lot of times children is like, I'm not going to eat that, right? So I was all excited. I brought it in and I had about 8 students at the time, and a couple of them tried it, but most of them was like, "Ugh, that's nasty, that's nasty." And then a couple that tried it didn't want no more of it because the rest of them was like, "Ugh, that's nasty," right? At that moment, I got an idea. I was like, you know what? Instead of me just bringing something to them and expecting them to try it, I got to make this participatory. So the next time I had an idea of exposing them to something, I made sure that I brought ingredients in and they contributed in the preparation of what it was. So there were like yogurt parfaits and I used some fruit that they usually wouldn't eat, at home or, in their community. And because they put their hands in it and they were involved in the process, they gave it a chance. Most of them did. Some of them were still like, "Oh, that's nasty." But most of them gave it a chance because they were included in that process, right? And that's something that I learned that was very important in terms of also exposure to cultural enrichment and getting our children in a space where they can learn a little bit more about our human family members that may not live right next door. Creating these opportunities where now they can participate. And one easy pathway to culture is through cuisine, especially if it tastes good, right? Next slide. And I put this here because sometimes people's attitudes is like this, regardless of what I'm talking about. That's how they feel, right? But here's the consequences of that attitude. Next slide. If we are invisible, then our experiences are invisible. And it goes back to what I said initially about ignorance or the ability to just ignore things. And the two twin siblings that hang out with ignorance, what was the other two that I said? Apathy and indifference, right? Because that sense of invisibility and that lack of care and concern creates these type of circumstances. Next slide. This is one example of what happens when a person has that attitude, right? Next slide. This and this. And this is important because usually having this type of conversation about cultural competence and things being diverse and equitable and accessible and inclusive, when that is not the standard, then usually some people are not at the table. And usually they're not at the table because they are today's special on that menu, right? Lightly seasoned with some chips and a pickle spear on the side, right? So next slide. So here's the importance not only of interpersonal growth and development, but the intra-group work, how we're able to connect this perspective to those who are in our family as well as in our community, is we gain knowledge of each other's worldview and better understand the culture of those with whom we coexist. This can lessen the othering of our people, not those people, our people. Because if we allow something to happen to one of our family members, then it's going to happen to us tomorrow, potentially, right? And at the same time, exposing ourselves to this type of knowledge of those particular worldviews, it allows us to have access to things that can enhance our quality of life. You know, when you look at different cultures and the type of perspectives that they have towards health and wellness, there's a lot of issues that we deal with right here in America that if we just incorporated certain type of herbs or seasonings, or even practice a form of caloric restriction and not eating as much that you see as traditional to other societies, we could cut a lot of our different issues that we have health-wise right in half. I was in Tanzania at the beginning of the year, and I was so impressed. I went back in like 7 months. I brought like 7 people back with me. And when I'm there, I was drinking water from a natural stream from a mountain called Mount Meru. And I look at a couple of some of the family members that are there, and I was explaining to them, like, I can't drink the water here in Western New York, and they couldn't believe it. That just didn't register them because their quality of life was much different than the type of quality of life that we live here, right? But being able to have access to them and to learn from them, it gave me much more clear ideas on ways that I can enhance my quality of life and also make that accessible to others as well. And that's one reason why I brought others back with me so they could experience that also. We access opportunities to unpack, process, and potentially heal from common experiences, including trauma. And that's vitally important because sometimes a person can feel as if this only happens to them. You know, giving tours, I was speaking to a family on Friday. I was doing a night tour at the Underground Railroad Heritage Center. And the woman that came up to me after the tour, her heritage is Jewish. And after going through the space, she was able to see the clear connection of that journey of freedom seekers here in this country to her family members who were also freedom seekers. It wasn't something that I communicated to her, but her being in that environment and listening to the stories of the Underground Railroad, she was able to make that connection in terms of seeing the sense of humanity as well as inhumanity that could be practiced by our family members that restricts our ability to live our cultural free. Um, Discover shared new principles, values, and customs that can potentially enrich our quality of life. And that just speaks to what I said initially about even health and wellness. We learn to better navigate cross generational, social, economic, educational, religious, and political encounters. And I oftentimes compare the journey of cultural competence of being in a dark room and striving to find the light switch in that room without touching the walls, right? Now, usually, when people grow up into this country and they're educated about the worldview of being an American and the history of this country, there are a lot of things that are deliberately left out. I was talking to some youth the other day, and I was telling them how I grew up with 6 siblings, and I have twin brothers who are a year younger than me. So I was always responsible for reporting to my parents when we were out in the community. And if they were doing something bad, I would go and I'd tell my parents and tell them directly, this is what they were doing. Sometimes I'll be participating with them, right? And then when I went to report to my parents, do you think I told them everything? No. So I'm talking to these students and I'm like, yo, history's written the same way. They don't tell you everything. The same way you don't tell your parents or your guardians everything. And because of that, you have to be very intentional about learning things on your own and not just accepting anything on face value, because you're not going to have the accurate perspective of what something actually is. So in terms of learning how to better navigate those type of encounters, if you're not taking the initiative to learn some things, you're going to step on some toes. You're going to offend some people. There's no way around that. But if you take initiative and strive to ask questions and strive to learn certain things and to expose yourself to certain culture, you can minimize those type of encounters, right? I was doing an after school program one time, and then it eventually became a summer camp. And there was a child that was in the summer camp and he was homeschooled. And the parents never really exposed the child to social encounters. That child was never really around no other children. The first day of summer camp, this child, and they were about 9 years old, this child walked up to another child and just looked at him, looked down at the ground, picked up a handful of dirt, looked at the handful of dirt and just threw it right in his face to see what kind of reaction they were going to get, because they didn't know that that was not appropriate, right? So seeing that initial encounter, the whole summer camp, I had to consistently strive to teach this child about the social norms of interacting with other people and striving to stop some of those other children from putting their hands on him, because they never encountered him before. It was almost like he was prodding and poking them like they were aliens or something that he's never seen before, right? And that got him in situations where he was going to get hurt a lot of times simply because he was not exposed. And I think a lot of times the way that we are educated in this country, we're taught in such a way where it puts us in a very vulnerable situation. And it's a very risky situation when it comes to dealing with other people, because some people we may not know. Let me give you another example. I was at Wegmans one day and I had my 4-year-old with me, and we were in the checkout line. It was these 2 old white women that came up behind us, and they were having a conversation. They looked at me and my daughter, and they were smiling, and they said, I know you didn't buy this one here. Talking to about my daughter. And they didn't see nothing wrong with it. So in my mind, I'm thinking like, well, they were probably born in 1895. So I have a respect for my elders. At the same time, I got to figure out a way to kind of check them to let them know that that's not appropriate. And, it was pretty awkward for me. Right. But obviously, these young women had never been exposed to my people before to realize, like, yo, that is completely inappropriate to say something like that. Right. But again, when you have less experience and exposure to culture, you maximize those type of opportunities for something to happen. And usually you have no control over the reaction or the way in which people are going to, respond to what it is that you do. And again, you have a segment of our population who are devout racists, white supremacists, and that's how they live. And they are beholden to that attitude. But for the most part, you got people who just are right-handed dominant, and that's the way that they've been learning. Lastly, it's all about mutual respect and an investment in relationships that help foster community building and collective work and responsibility. And it takes time to get to that type of point, because if you're in your 30s or your 40s and you've never really listened to rap music before, you got some time to listen to an entire genre of music that, for me personally, that's been like my background music for my life. I could point out certain songs the same way some of you could point out certain songs and remember where you were at, or, you were in the back of the car with your girlfriend, or you were at the drive-in theater, or all of these different experiences. I have the exact same type of music, right? And being able to develop those relationships with one another, you could learn some perspective. And a lot of times you see that we all share the same human emotions. Sometimes we arrive at different conclusions, but we're all one human family. Next slide. So, in conclusion, I just wanted to answer any questions that you may have, if I can. And I appreciate you just all taking the time to be here with us this morning. Thank you. So, I got any questions?